Hello, and welcome to another edition of Brussels Sprouts. I'm Andrea Kendall-Taylor.
And I'm Jim Townsend.
And we're so glad you can join us. In a highly anticipated Canadian federal election on April 28th, Mark Carney, former head of the central banks of Canada and the UK, and a politician for less than 2 months, led the Liberal Party to a stunning comeback victory. Just 4 months earlier, the same party, led by former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, was standing on the precipice of defeat. Since taking over the party in March, Carney managed one of the most remarkable political turnarounds in Western democratic history. The election was fought against the backdrop of rising tensions between Canada and the United States. President Trump's combative stance played a significant role in salvaging the Liberals' fortunes, as Carney was viewed as the safe pair of hands when dealing with the administration. Yet, as Carney's White House visit earlier this week underscored, the tensions between the United States and Canada are likely to persist. To analyze the election results and their implications for Canadian foreign policy, we're pleased to welcome Richard Nossal and Elizabeth Anderson to the podcast today. Kim is a professor emeritus in the Department of Political Studies at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, and the author of Canada Alone. Elizabeth is a Fulbright Scholar and visiting associate fellow in CNAS's Transatlantic Security Program, as well as a former senior advisor in the Office of Canada's Foreign Minister. Elizabeth, let me start with you. Set the scene a little bit. So we're picking up from our first episodes. We should note this is a very historic second episode on Canada and Canadian politics. Many thanks to your initiatives. But set the scene for us a little bit. We just had this election as I described, but how would you articulate what has played out over the last several weeks with the election and the White House visit?
So the last couple of weeks, as you noted, was historic from a Canadian political perspective. The Liberal Party was at a save the furniture position back in January before Prime Minister Trudeau resigned on January 6th. The Trump effect is noted for having helped the Liberals come to this historic comeback, 3 seats away from a majority government with 169 seats in Parliament. 172 is required for a majority. I would note that it was not only the Trump effect, but the fact that Prime Minister Trudeau resigned that allowed for this to coalesce into the election results that transpired on April 20th, I should say. But the current White House visit, by all stretches of the imagination, from a Canadian perspective, was a success. Sure, there was nothing of substance that was agreed to, but it reset the relationship. And the Prime Minister got what he needed in terms of a Canadian soundbite, which was Canada is not for sale, and we will never be the 51st state, which for all Canadians back home, regardless of which province you are residing, that was the most important thing for the Prime Minister to have reiterated in the White House visit.
Kim, over to you. And actually, let's drill down first on the election, and then we can come more to the White House visit. And I think what was notable, too, was that the Conservative Party had such a remarkable lead in the polls going into the election. So can you talk a little bit about what happened with the Conservatives, where they were in the run-up to the election, and some of the factors that other than Trump, really that allowed Carney to pull off, as we described, this really significant political comeback?
Well, what I would add to Elizabeth's comments is one factor that we need to always keep front and center, and that is that Mr. Carney and the Liberal Party ran a really good campaign. Even though we're talking about someone who has not been a politician for very long, Mr. Carney ended up pulling the rabbit out of the hat in part because of the Trump effect, yes, but a lot of it had to do with the kind of quality campaign that he and the Liberal Party ran. The Conservatives found themselves in to be blunt, an unfortunate situation from their perspective, and that is that for so long Pierre Poilievre, the conservative leader, had been running a campaign focused almost exclusively on Justin Trudeau. And then all of a sudden, Mr. Trudeau, looking at the situation, resigning in early January, literally deprived Poilievre of the target that he had been focused on for so long. And it seems to me that it was in large part Poilievre's inability to make that transition to a new situation in a way that was compelling, that led to not only the defeat of the party across the country, but of course to Mr. Poilievre failing to gain election to parliament in his own seat in the Ottawa area. Uh, and that, it seems to me, is one of the key elements in understanding where this election came from. The Conservative Party actually did very, very well, but Mr. Poilievre, not so much.
Just to go off of that point, which is an excellent one, I would argue that Mr. Poilievre's defeat in his own riding speaks to the larger. He is not widely popular for the people that really dislike him. So he is popular within the Conservative Party. To Kim's point, he expanded the base. Both the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party got over 40% of the popular vote in Canada, which is not normal. But the Canadians that really dislike his rhetoric, his style of politics, his more hostile framing, and lack of, from a Canadian perspective, the normal civility that is seen in Canadian politics. A huge amount of money came from outside of the riding. And it was the riding in the whole country that had the highest turnout on advanced polls. And you saw volunteers coming from not just his riding, but all across the greater Ottawa region to knock doors to try and defeat him. So while he is popular within the Conservative base, he has a huge number of Canadians that are just very anti the politics that he is representing. And to their in their opinion, it is very reflective of the kind of politics that Trump has brought to the American society here within the last election.
Elizabeth, you've mentioned this before, and you just touched on it now, with the Liberals and Conservatives both over 40%. And I assume then that's at the expense of some of the smaller parties within the political spectrum. Is, looking at polarization and other issues in the United States, but also in other democracies, is this indicative of a deeper polarization in Canadian politics? Or what is this about? And how do you both view the implications for Canadian politics going forward? Is this going to be the new normal?
So I don't think that this will be the new normal. I do think that it speaks to a bit of polarization in Canada, but not in the same way that it is viewed in the U.S. It was the percentage that the Conservatives got and the Liberals got was largely at the expense of the New Democratic Party, which is the 0.5 or third party within the Canadian federal government. They collapsed. They lost official party status. The official party status is 12 seats in the House of Commons. They're now at 7. So it was in part that progressives on the left of the spectrum decided that they really disliked Pierre Poilievre, and in order to defeat him, they would park their vote with the Liberals in order to have the greatest chance of ensuring that he didn't become prime minister, which is an effect that is played out in different elections, but not to this same extent. And then for the Conservatives, for the dichotomy between the Liberals and the Conservatives and the fact that it is very much a two-party election, and we have seen a collapse of the smaller parties, including the Bloc Party, which is a separatist party in Quebec. While they still had a number of seats, they're still above 20. It was not the same above 30 seats that they had in the previous government, and it wasn't as much as they would have wanted before the election occurred. I would argue that this speaks to, if not the polarization within Canada, but very much the difference of opinions within the Canadian populace, especially when it comes to the western part of Canada, which is more conservative oriented, and the central and eastern part of Canada, which is more capital L Liberal Party oriented, that they have a different view of what they want the future of Canada to look like. And at this particular moment, so much of this election was based on what is the Canada that we want in a 21st century standpoint. This is seen as being one of the most historic and revolutionary elections in terms of how Canada is going to reset itself, not only domestically, but internationally, given where we're at in the geopolitical environment.
Yeah, Kim, you can add to that too. But one thing I would just note is like it resonates with me. So in the work that Erica France and Joe Wright had done in the book that we put out on the origins of electoral strongmen, one of the things we examined was the relationship between these kind of far right populist candidates and polarization. And there's kind of this idea before in the literature that polarization is what enables a lot of these populist right wing leaders to emerge. But what we kind of flipped it on its head, and what we found is that these leaders themselves are actually a considerable source of polarization. And just as you described, Elizabeth, people who then take a harder position on in either direction, either because they are part of the base or in reaction to what these leaders do. So that's really interesting. It's not that Poilievre was taking advantage of an already polarized electorate, but he himself was a driver and source of polarization.
To a certain extent, yes. Except that one of the things that we're seeing emerge, and I think we saw it emerge in Canada. We certainly saw it emerge in Australia in their election last weekend, and that is that some of the hardiest populists actually are having difficulty transforming their populism into seats in a parliamentary context. And so while we can talk about polarization, and I would encourage you to think about it in the context that Elizabeth talked about, and that is to think about the sort of the divisions regionally. If you look at an electoral map of Canada, um, the the blue, and in Canada, our Conservative Party is blue and our Liberal Party is red, exactly the opposite
Yes,
in
very
the United
confusing.
States. Yeah, true. But Western Canada is this huge expanse of blue, and so there's that regional difference. But there also is a considerable division between rural and suburban and urban Canada, and so that the Liberals did very well in urban areas. The Conservatives managed to do very well in rural areas, and there was a fight in the suburban areas around Canada's major cities. And so that the polarization that we see in Canada, and I would argue also in Australia, is not at all like the polarization that we've seen emerge in the United States.
Yeah, really, really very helpful points. Let's transition a little bit then to the US Canada relationship. And so, I mean, Elizabeth, you talked a little bit about the White House visit and the way that Mark Carney, like that it was viewed as a win. Um, do you think that was like a little glimpse of the way that US Canada relations will develop moving forward? What do you expect from Mark Carney and how he will approach and handle the Trump administration?
So it's a great question. I think that realistically, this was probably one of the more civil conversations that they will have. I think that President Trump will be displeased to figure out that Prime Minister Carney will be very firm in his stance of defending Canada. And he deeply believes that Canada has certainly more leverage than what the American administration believes Canada does. There is a clip going around social media of the specific moment, the specific screenshot of President Trump saying that the United States doesn't do much business with Canada, and Prime Minister Carney's face, which is still a politician and still trying to be, not showing too much of his emotions, but he clearly disagrees with that, and the facts would back him up on this. So he has said that there's the historic relationship between Canada and the US, one from a Canadian perspective that was founded upon deeper integration within the American system, both economically and from a security perspective, is over. And I suspect, especially when it comes to the renegotiations of what you call USMCA, in Canada we call CUSMA, um, I think that he will try and expand the agreement towards a bilateral agreement with the US that encompasses things beyond just the economic pillars and incorporates security agreements, critical minerals, things like this. And that will be part of his positioning to try and rebalance the asymmetry within the relationship and try and ensure that Canada has more leverage to hold over the US to ensure that Canada gets a good deal.
Kim, you want
but
to add and one, let me add one little teeny bit to the question too, is like how permanent of a rupture do Canadians think this is, or is there a sense that this is very specific to Trump?
No, this is, I mean, I think that when Mr. Carney talked about the relationship, the traditional relationship being over, I think that a huge number of Canadians understand precisely what he's saying. We've never had an administration in Washington for at least the last 80 years, and in fact, very much longer. We've never had an administration in Washington that has demonstrated the kind of animus towards Canada that this administration has. Um, yes, there were lots of smiles, sometimes a little forced, at the White House the other day, but behind both sides is, I think, a recognition, certainly in the Canadian context, that we're not ever going to go back to the kind of relationship that we used to enjoy with the United States, where there was a fundamental sense of trust. I mean, Mr. Carney openly uses the word, the sort of the American betrayal. And in that sense, he's giving voice to a sentiment that you can hear all over the place in Europe, in the Western Pacific, in Oceania, about how the transformation of American foreign and defense policy and the transformation of the United States itself constitutes a huge departure and thus a betrayal. I think that this is permanent, and even if the midterms in 26 result in a change in congressional power, even if a Democrat is returned in the 2028 election, um, I don't believe that people are simply going to go and say, let's resurrect what we used to have. I think that Mr. Carney is quite correct. Those days are over.
It feels very much from a Canadian perspective, it's that old saying of fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. And from the Canadian perspective, Trump round one and the tariffs and the negotiation, tearing up of NAFTA and the hostilities that came after that of renegotiating to what ended up being the USMCA agreement, we could live with that. That was a blink in a moment. That was an unpleasant time, but we could get over it. Now, especially with the rhetoric of 51st state and the threats to our sovereignty, Canadians won't go back. It just doesn't. We do feel betrayed, and one of the greatest symbolic representations of this, of just the significant movement of Canadian nationalism that I've never seen in my lifetime. You now see Canadian flags flying everywhere. And we're not flag flying people. That's not a normal thing. And you even see them in the heart of separatist Quebec, which is, I cannot overstate how remarkable that is.
What you both have said is so sad and heartbreaking. It is puzzling in some respects that we have found ourselves in this place because this what Trump says and what he does and maybe some of the people around him just does not represent anybody that I know in the United States. No one. That's not something you hear in a bar room or around the Thanksgiving table or cocktail chat or someone dumping on Canada. No one does that. And so for me to have this one man cause a rupture between two peoples, one group of peoples who totally don't feel this way, is terrible. I mean, and I understand where it's coming from, Kim. I understand your point, and you too, Elizabeth, very much. I understand that it's not a blink. It's not a. I do understand that the pride at a minimum, uh, but I guess I just the idea that that even among the people around Trump, you don't hear this much. It just comes from him, and he's alienated a lot of Americans too. Let me tell you. So
Oh yeah.
I that it breaks my heart hearing that. And I do have a question, but I just thought I would say that I'm really profoundly moved by what you both said, and I don't and I hope that you're I hope I was going to say I hope that you're wrong. I don't think you're wrong, but I hope that we can in fact recover from this. It might take time, but as the American people en masse, and I will speak for the American people right now. Boy, we just love Canada, and I just having this one man cause this to happen is just a tragedy. Just a tragedy. Um, but I don't know if I should even ask a question after all that. But my question is, I guess the integration certainly involves the military integration. We NORAD is famous for that, and as I've said, it was a Canadian general who was the deputy director of NORAD after on 9/11, who was the one that pulled the switch to stop all air flights over North America, at least over the United States. And of course, the wonderful support that we got from Canada as nations, as airlines had to fly into Canadian airports, and we know all of that. The famous play. Uh,
Turning away.
yeah, and so but I say that because our militaries are quite integrated. The U.S. Navy and the Canadian Navy are, and NORAD, of course, is Air Force, and that's becoming even more important in this age of hostilities with Russia uh, that we kind of share. So I'm just wondering, what do you think is going to happen on that end? I mean, what does Carney think about the Canadian military? Everybody spending more money on defense. Uh, you know, um, is the do you think that that disengagement will be on the military side as well?
Uh, Absolutely, it is going to be on the military side, and that's going to be uh, uh, a tight squeeze to navigate because I think that Canadians and this government in particular, in fact, any Canadian government understands that there's no uh, removing ourselves from the joint defense of North America. The logic of what led to the creation of NORAD in the late 1950s, that logic is still there. And so that you can absolutely anticipate that Canada will continue to do what it has always done and since the 1950s. And bluntly put, Jim, that's one of the reasons why I too am so saddened by the United States having a president who has no idea about the evolution of a 70-year commitment by both countries to the joint defense of the continent. It's quite
Right.
clear that he just simply doesn't understand that. That's not going to go away. But really, what I think is going to go away is that strong and long-standing commitment on the part of the Canadian military to be as tightly interwoven with the United States military as we've become. It's quite clear that if the United States continues to pursue a particular foreign policy, as Mr. Trump has pursued, then the that connection is necessarily going to be broken. Not necessarily in terms of the defense of North America, but our global vision is going to differ quite considerably from that of the United States in the future, it seems to me.
The only point I would add on to that is that this is going to be driven from the political level. This is going to be top down. The military, including the top brass of the Canadian military, do not want this to happen. They are quite interested in maintaining the deep partnership that they have come to rely upon and value over the last several decades. But just as a way of how our system operates, they will be forced to change because the politics of the government and the politics of Canada has changed in this moment. So a good example of this is the Canadian government. Before we called an election, Prime Minister asked for a review of the F-35 program. What that's going to mean in when the review comes back and what the government will do with the results of that review remain to be seen. But it is going to be driven from the politics of the federal government instructing the military that they must diversify and they must figure out the ways in which, yes, some areas, to your point, for the defense of North America, there is no getting away from the Americans. We will continue to have collaborative defense of the continent. But in terms of the broader, where we position ourselves within NATO, where we position ourselves within the Indo-Pacific, et cetera, these will be the areas that we will look to diversify and probably pull away from the American position.
Could I ask a quick follow up? It almost makes me think that this kind of deep seated reaction and deep feelings and these emotional feelings and the quick toppling of this ancient relationship between our two countries, it's almost as if, and tell me if I'm wrong, because I might very well be here, although that's unusual, but it might very well be that it's almost like Canada was. This is almost like this was the last straw. Like Canada was already kind of teetering with in terms of feeling the relationship between the U.S. and Canada wasn't in a good place. Canada didn't. Canada felt dissed. Canada felt itself over time in this place where all it took was Donald Trump coming on the scene and saying what he did to make it go. That it wasn't like it was solid and everyone was happy and we were getting along and we were all integrated and marching together shoulder to shoulder. Because if it had been that, then Trump, that would have shaken everybody up, but it wouldn't have had such the impact. But instead, it sounds like it was teetering. Was it teetering?
Jim, you're wrong. I'm going to pass it over to Elizabeth for her reaction.
I love when Jim's wrong.
I'm confident that Kim will have
more in the history books.
more to say on this. Two things. When I worked for the Liberal foreign government under, or the Liberal government in the foreign ministry under Trudeau and for our foreign minister, Melanie Joly, I can tell you that when it was the Biden administration and when it was Secretary Blinken, it's not a given that we will go with what the Americans want or the position that they are advocating that they want us to take. But if Secretary Blinken says he wants a call with the foreign minister, we are making that call happen. Unless she is in the air and unable to take the call, we will be on the phone line. The Americans were our most important partner, and ensuring that we don't walk too far out of step with them was definitely important to the government. Sure, there are certain positions that we will take a different approach. Israel-Palestine would be a very large one in the last couple of years. But they were seen in an entirely different category than any other ally or partner that exists. The one thing I will say about to a bit of your point, Jim, but not entirely, from the Canadian society perspective, if you were to go back in 2000, Canada felt similar to their American counterpart in a way that similarity of our two societies is no longer. So the way that the US society has evolved since 2000 to 2025 versus the way that the Canadian society has evolved in that same period, we have moved closer to Europe. We have continued on what many in America would consider a socialist agenda. I don't think that's entirely fair from an actual ideological context. I think Canada is a very egalitarian society, but nonetheless, we do have socialist elements within our society. And we are closer to our European allies in terms of the way we think about the world and the way we think about how government operates within our society. So that would be a difference. But it wasn't a given that this is where we would end up. That is very much a result of the threats to our sovereignty and just the general dislike of President Trump and his certain style of politics in Canada, regardless of political party.
So
But
just the blows of that one man
yeah,
toppled it.
but it's more than the
Wow.
blows of it's more than the blows of a single individual. If Mr. Trump were to suddenly resign right now, it wouldn't make a great deal of difference. However, it is absolutely the case that when you have a president who denies um, uh, such simple and fundamental facts as the kind of huge trade relationship that we have, when you have a president who believes that when you bring trade down to nothing, that is in the interests of the United States. When you have a president who believes that, quote unquote, the United States is subsidizing Canada to the tune of 100 or 200 or $250 billion a year, are all the figures he's used. When you have someone who doesn't seem to understand supply chains, when you have a president who truly seems to believe that it is those whose products are being tariffed will pay the tariffs rather than the long suffering American taxpayer, then you've got a serious, serious difficulty um, in how the Canadians view this. And
Yeah.
when you have a president who insists on imposing the kind of crushing tariffs that Mr. Trump has, that have huge impacts on particular Canadian localities, then yes, you're going to have all of this kind of reaction, including a kind of an emotional reaction, in large measure because of the kind of threat that Elizabeth referred to, and that is, we haven't had serious annexation threats from the United States for well over 100 years. I mean, it really hasn't been since the McKinley administration, the president that Mr. Trump loves so much. Um, the McKinley tariffs of the 1890s were absolutely designed to get Canadians to start pressing for being annexed by the United States. We haven't had that, and I think that there's a huge degree of resentment in Mr. Trump's approach to other countries' sovereignty, and it's not just Canada. I mean, keep in mind, Mr. Trump appears to care absolutely nothing about our sovereignty, but he also cares absolutely nothing about Greenlandic sovereignty or Danish sovereignty or Panamanian sovereignty. And that concerns Canadians simply because we are so susceptible, because we've allowed ourselves to become so deeply integrated.
Yeah.
I'm going
Thank
to
you.
just push back for one more second. I obviously hear you loud and clear, but I'm going to push this issue one more time on, is this just Trump and will Canadians say it that way? I mean, all the things that you said, his love for McKinley, all of these things are very specific to President Trump. And as Jim said, this isn't really a widely held idea in US society. When you think of the relationship with Europe, you could probably find more pockets of discontent with the relationship with Europe, more Americans buying into the idea that the EU was created to screw the US, as Trump has said, more Americans who think that Europe has free ridden, with low defense spending. So that there is maybe some more societal basis. But the Canada piece, I really don't see it. And so here, like, I'm going to ask one more time. So, but then the thing I thought was so interesting was just from yesterday with the Munich Security Conference here in the United States, and JD Vance he was the only part of that event that was made public, had a very different tone on Europe, and you had a lot of Europeans kind of really breathing a sigh of relief. And of course, one speech doesn't undo all of the things that we're
Exactly.
talking about, but there was relief. And so I guess I am just pushing back on this idea of kind of like the irreparable damage. And Kim, you said something like when Trump leaves, you don't think anything would change. But I'm not sure about that. So
Well,
I guess I'm just going to push one more time on this irreparable
sure.
thing, in part because I mean I share all the sentiment that Jim so wonderfully put out there about how horrible and upsetting this is. So that, like, is it really irreparable, or with another administration that actually recognizes the value of allies and partners and good neighbors and everything else? Don't you think it could be repaired?
Let me jump in and just recall Elizabeth's notion of sort of shame on me
Yeah.
for thinking about the possibility of a kind of reconciliation. Because let's face it, what has happened in the last 10 years, because it's not just simply this Trump administration, it's also the first one. The reality is that American voters in 2024, the 77 million Americans who took a look at Mr. Trump in his first 4 years and his behavior since he ceased to be president, and the 110 million Americans who didn't bother to vote. And this is where I would come back at you and say that the dissolution of trust that has happened, and I think it's not just Canada. Of course, Europeans are going to are going to breathe a sigh of relief. When the vice president of the United States, someone who may well become the president, sort of says nice things, but all you have to do is to look at the clear animus that Mr. Vance has towards Europeans and also, by the way, towards Canadians. Just check out his Twitter feed when he talks about Canada and fentanyl, and you get a very different view. Yes, you can be pleased to hear what you don't expect out of his mouth, but boy, I wouldn't take that to the market. That's where I think the difficulty is, that we no longer can trust that the good voters of the United States are going to return a president and an administration and a Congress that is going to act in the interests of the broader Western grouping of countries that every single administration, from Mr. Truman all the way through to Mr. Obama, and then finally the Biden administration, we just can't. We simply won't be able to trust that Americans will continue that,
Yeah,
and
very well articulated.
that's why it's irreparable.
Yeah.
I would also just add on, which Kim's book that very much foreshadowed some of this, the return of Trump and what the position would be for Canada in the title Canada Alone. The Europeans have more an ability to take that and sigh a breath of relief and think that the recalibration could be something that is more to their liking, because the Europeans have all of the member states to rely on. They're a much bigger market. They have much more power. They have much more of an ability to go against the Americans and to still get what they want out of a deal. Canada is by themselves. Even if we try and swing ourselves closer to Europe and build out our trade diversification in these things, Canada is alone. And we fundamentally know this. So it is not in our strategic interest. It is not wise for us to believe that we can pass this moment by and think that it is just a moment in time in the US. Because one, this is the return of Trump. This is not the first time. And all of the excuses that you could have in the first Trump administration of, they didn't know better, the Electoral College, the Clinton and the emails, all of these things, you can't say that the second time. And I just think that in Canada, from a national pride perspective and a deep desire and certainty that we must protect our sovereignty, it is not going to be seen in our fundamental interest to continue to deepen ourselves with America. As much as it personally pains me that this is where we're at, because we have had the most prosperous and mutually beneficial relationship between our two countries for the last at least 80 decades. The fact that we share the world's largest unmanned border is symbolic of what the relationship has been. And I just think that we are no longer at that point.
Let me pull your Europe thread and talk a little bit about then where Canada goes. And you can fill in the details or correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there was a recent poll that showed a significant uptick in Canadians' favorability towards joining the EU. Is that the direction that we're going? Is Canada move? I mean, and Elizabeth, you made the wonderful point too about the divergence of our societies and the way that the United States has moved in one way, and Canada in many ways has moved more in a European direction. So is that the next kind of logical extension of where Canada goes next?
So I think yes and no. We are never going to escape our geography. We are a huge country that is on top of the world's greatest economic and military power. That is not changing. As much as we might wish to be attached to the European continent, we are not. We do share a new land border with them through the Hans Island Agreement that was signed with Greenland and Denmark in June of 2022, which was the end of a 50-year dispute between our two countries. But it is structurally and geographically, I would say, near impossible, at least at this particular moment, and certainly as the blueprint of the European Union is laid out at the moment, for us to truly consider EU membership. But a shift towards Europe and a deepening of that relationship, including structurally, is absolutely where we will try and balance ourselves. And this can be this was illustrated perfectly in Prime Minister Carney's very purposeful first visit as prime minister when he was sworn in, that he immediately went to Paris and London. And when he returned, he also went up to Nunavut in Iqaluit, the capital of the Nunavut territorial province that we have. But it was symbolic in that they tried to speak to Canada's origins of having French, British, and Indigenous roots, and a return to that kind of origin story of Canada. And I think that especially the Prime Minister will be very interested to follow where London, Paris, to a certain extent, Berlin go in shaping out what Europe will be in the new security architecture. I think we will try and get into the new defense fund that the EU is rolling out. We will, I think, try and see if we can build something of a Norway EU model between our two countries. The EU and Canada, over the last decade, under the leadership of Prime Minister Trudeau and under from the EU Council side, President von der Leyen, has already significantly enhanced itself. The two had a bit of a professional romance, as they say. They really had a fondness for each other. So the pillars are there. And I think you will absolutely see the Prime Minister do what he can to integrate Canada more collectively and structurally into the European framework, so that we, once again, do not feel that we are all alone in this, that we have an ability to reach out to other partners and rebalance ourselves against the U.S.
Kim, anything you want to add in? And has this had the Trump effect on Canadian defense? So obviously, the byproduct of Trump has been a significant increase in military spending in the European NATO allies. Are we going to see something similar in Canada?
I think we're going to see something similar, but because of and in the direction of the kinds of things that Elizabeth was talking about. In other words, what we're likely to see is the Canadian government will reassess its defense priorities. It will, of course, privilege North American aerospace defense and in cooperation with the United States. But I can also see where the Canadians will decide to put many more resources into the North into the Arctic for the purposes not only of sovereignty protection, but also because the North is where there's going to be a greater geopolitical conflict in the next decade and a half. And in that sense, it seems to me that we're going to put a heavy emphasis, I would suspect, on participating and cooperating with European partners rather than with the United States. And in particular, given the circumpolar world that we're about to enter, it seems to me that there are lots of opportunities for that kind of defense cooperation in the North.
If I could ask your view on something, I was going to ask about the European Union as well, and see if you were going to do a Norway like relationship or agreement. But that's already been answered very well. And so let me ask you this: what would you advise a new president who comes in after 4 years? And let's not assume it's JD Vance. That it could be a Republican, it could be a Democrat. But what's the way ahead in terms of the U.S. Canadian relationship now? I mean, what does it look like? Is it? I can't imagine it being mean. I can't. I mean, this is talking about another day. I can't imagine it would be something where we would be hostile or where we wouldn't vacation in each other's countries or. I mean, I guess it'll be a proper, maybe is how we would describe it. It'd be a proper relationship, not a UK-like special relationship or a, troublesome thing like sometimes with France. I mean, what does it look like, and what would you advise that next president to try to recover the relationship? Do we not try? Does it make it worse if we try
Well,
to do it, or?
I think a lot will depend on what kind of damage gets done between now and a different president, a different administration. I mean, keep in mind that
We're
one
only
of the
100
reasons.
days in. I
What's
know
that?
there's a lot of. I said we're only
Well,
a little over 100 days in. There's a lot more
there
damage to be
there
done.
are as the economist said, only 1,300 and some odd days to go. But I mean, think simply of cross-border travel. I mean, think of why Canadians are now so hesitant to visit the United States. A small number because of sort of ideological purity. Oh, I don't want to go to the United States when it's in this kind of mode. But an awful lot has to do with the fact that the United States, because of this administration, is now very much less welcoming. And most individuals have to worry now about what happens when they are randomly selected for enhanced interrogation. Because the stories that come out of the border are just terrible. And so you've seen this huge decline. And that's the kind of damage that just it's damaged by lots of tiny little cuts. And so that in 2029, it will very much depend on what kind of damage has the Trump administration actually done to the huge elements of the relationship. I mean, as Jim, as you put it, it's a huge, vast, and complex relationship that has numerous different elements, and so therefore it can be hurt and damaged in so many different ways.
So, I don't disagree with anything that Kim has said, but Jim, I know you are looking for at least some glimmer of hope. So I will give you a glimmer of hope.
And anytime we can end on a positive note is a win on Brussels sprouts. So do it, Elizabeth.
All right. So Canadians are famous for saying sorry. This is going to be key. And I know that I say this, and that's going to be very hard for any future U.S. administration. The Americans aren't really known for saying sorry. But that is 100%, in my opinion, what it is going to take. You are going to, if you really want a reset of the Canada-US relationship, the next administration is going to have to eat some humble pie, and they are going to have to come to Ottawa and say, I am sorry. And if you say, I am sorry, Canadians are reasonably forgiving people, and that will at least set a new tone and a new tenor for the future of the relationship. But if the next administration basically comes in and they say, we aren't the previous administration and we're just going to go back to business as usual, that will not be accepted. There is no going back to business as usual. So an apology, first and foremost, which I'm not confident will come, but that would be my greatest recommendation. And then if you could eat some humble pie and apologize, I would say it doesn't matter if it was a Democrat or a Republican administration. For years, the Canadian government has felt that the US takes Canada for granted. And for years, that has been accepted because our relationship is what it is and we benefit, and there is lots of positive things to be found. And Canada certainly does historically benefit from the close ties that they have to the Americans. So this is one of the things that the Canadian government has put up with. But in future, that kind of being taken for granted, not understanding how much Canada actually means to your own society in terms of the security and especially your economy, that will need to be recalibrated within the US administration so that they actually start looking at, okay, what are some of the things that the Canadians want? Not only what do I want, but what are the Canadians hoping to get out of this? How can we cooperate in a way that is not as asymmetrical as historically the relationship has been? So I do think that there is always hope. There is always positivity to be found, even if in the darkest corners of the world. And I do think that certainly a more positive point of the relationship can be found, but I do think it is going to require some real humble pie from the US. And I just don't think that that is the American strong suit, regardless of whether you have a Democrat or a Republican administration in the White House.
Well, Jim and I are about to eat some humble pie. On behalf of the United States, we are very sorry that we are at this point. And so I hope deeply and sincerely that at some point we obviously get back to something that is a more reasonable relationship. I wish we could apologize on behalf of the United States because it is such an important relationship.
Hey, any time that I receive an apology from an American on behalf of their government, I say thank you very much for the support and kindness.
Well, this was a tough conversation, certainly to hear, but a really important one, a really insightful one. And so thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you, Kim, for joining us.
A real pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Brussels Sprouts, brought to you by the Transatlantic Security Team at the Center for a New American Security. You can find all of our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts. And please remember to rate and review Brussels Sprouts so that new listeners are able to find the show.